Okay, thank you to the entire HSS team for inviting me here. I hope some of what I say will be of use to you in terms of your research and further interest. What I want to do is, think about ideas of work, contemporary work, and youth culture, and then question one of the things, or talk about one of the things that that has been much talked about in the social sciences over the last 2 decades, which is the idea of neoliberalism. What does it mean? You would have all come across this term in different sociological and other kinds of academic texts. And I want to talk about the idea of neoliberal processes and contexts through thinking about new forms of work that young people are being trained for, are being asked to take part in certain kinds of work. So my beginning point is a term that was used in the 1980s by an American sociologist called Ali Russell Hochschild, and she uses the term emotional labor. Right? She wants to differentiate how new forms of work are different from older forms of work. So Hochschild's field work was among the cabin crew of Delta Airlines. Okay, so emotional labor refers to a particular kinds of work that are not necessarily physical, bodily intensive. That is, they're not intensive in terms of physical labor, but require certain forms of presentation of the self, certain forms of dealing with others, such that, as Hochschild was to suggest, that internal emotions become an aspect of public representation. Okay, so you utilize emotions in your work, and I will do this through 3 specific sites that I've been working on, in order to think about these issues about the relationship between emotional labor, neoliberalism, the state and how it functions, and private capital and new forms of work. So the 3 sites that I have in mind are, one is the government of India has this huge skills development program. Right now it's called the Deen Dayal Upadhyay program, and and I'm going to focus on some of those skills development programs. So one of my site of analysis is a government sponsored skills development center. So the government in India has these skills SDCs all over the country, but they have actually been outsourced to private companies. So I want to begin my talk with looking at one of these skills development centers in a place called Rajpur. This is not the real name of the town. It's not far from Jaipur. The second side of my analysis is another skills development center in Ranchi, and this functions under the scheme called the Roshni program. The government of India has, much more specifically, the Ministry of Rural Development has a program called the Roshni program, which it operates in what are referred to as left-wing extremist affected districts. Right? There's a particular term, LWEADs. Which stretches, these districts in the government's maps stretch across Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, and Jharkhand. So I'm going to look at one in Ranchi. And the third site that I'm going to look at is a privately run, what are known as, you would be familiar with those, personality development coaching center in Delhi. And I will call this center Westwing. That's not the actual name of the center. So through these 3 vignettes, I just want to talk about some of these ideas around enterprise, youth aspirations, and neoliberalism. Okay, just very briefly about the broader context. The broader context is that India has something called a very young population, and that this was, traditionally it was known as the demographic dividend, right? That you had a young population and you will have great economic growth because young people will go into workforce and carry out certain forms of economic activities which are good for the country. And increasingly we realize that because of the skills and capacities of the young people to take part in certain forms of work, that this so-called demographic dividend may not be forthcoming, right? So that the vast majority of the Indian population who are of working age may not have the skills to go into certain kinds of so-called productive work. So there's been a big skills push by the government of India. So under the 11th 5-year plan, 2007 to 2012, which recommended the creation of the National Skills Development Mission. So skills have become a great economic and policy buzzword, as you know. And I'm really interested in thinking about how do social scientists think about notions of skill? How do you situate it in context of caste networks, kinship networks, ideas, aspirations for particular kind of world and future that people want to have. Okay, Okay, so I'm going to, as I said, every government ministry has its own skills development program. I am going to speak of or discuss two skills development centers and one privately run personality development center, which also aims to train people for new kinds of work. And the private agency that I'm looking at actually trains people to become cabin crew, flight attendants, etc., etc. Okay. And just briefly, the government-run skill development program, which is, as I said, outsourced to private players who are known as project implementation agencies, PIAs. And each PIA in the rural part of the skill development program is given, for example, in Jharkhand, each PIA is given a different block within a district for what's known as mobilization. Once the blocks are allocated, you have mobilizers employed by the large companies who go into villages, who contact village gram panchayats, self-help groups, families, etc. So it's an entire structure that links national policy to village level activities. And young people are recruited from villages in Jharkhand, and the ones I'm looking at, of course, in the so-called left-wing extremist affected districts. So my interest is in trying to understand the relationship between ideas of new labor, skill, cosmopolitanism, violence, and the relationship between the state and private capital that produces certain forms of, or seeks to produce certain forms of work. And the Indian skill development program is actually quite small compared to the Chinese one, but nevertheless, it has one big difference with the Chinese one and the Indian one is that the Indian skill development program plays much greater emphasis on cultural skills, right? Because the service sector is seen to be infinitely expandable, and you can employ many more people than you can in the manufacturing sector, for example. Okay, so just to give you the broad sense that I'm really interested in things like youth aspirations, new class identity, gender politics, the institutionalization of consumer culture, and the remaking of state-capital relations. And you would have come across many academics who are working on this, such as Fernandez's work on the middle class, Nandini Guptu's work on enterprise culture, and various other kinds of, and Riti Lukose's work you may have come across in Kerala on youth culture, for example, Carol Upadhyay's work on IT sector workers. And I'll try and differentiate what I mean, what I'm trying to present to you differs from some of the other work. Okay, so let me begin with one perspective that addresses, you've heard the term neoliberalism, right? I'll explain to you. The one particular perspective, theoretically, in the social sciences, which addresses this area, this kind of skill that people are being asked to acquire, cultural skill, is, of course, the idea of emotional labor, where very early in the 1980s, as I said, the Hochschild, the American sociologist, coined this term called emotional labor. When she said the emotional life, she said we are witnessing a call. She said that she spoke of the ways in which workers in service sectors divide themselves into the real self and an on-stage self as a way of avoiding stress. However, she says that there's a commercialization of feeling. So when you board a plane, for example, and that person who's greeting you has to constantly say good morning, good afternoon, welcome, etc., whether she likes it or not, or he likes it or not. And this Hochschild referred to as a commercialization of feeling. And she suggested that all this poses serious problems, for she continued, in dividing up our sense of self in order to save the real self from unwelcome intrusions, we necessarily relinquish a healthy sense of wholeness. So here, the idea of people being forced to do something is posited as a kind of marginality, whereby there's a kind of alienation, right? That people are alienated from their real selves, which doesn't necessarily want to do these kinds of things. Where she said, a private emotional system has been subordinated to a commercial logic. In other words, briefly put, her argument would be that the service sector capitalism produces the split self, and the workers have become estranged from their real feelings. Right? That's not the real self. Basically, that's one argument. Now, another perspective which relates to this context, which has to do with neoliberalism work, is along the lines of, so for example, I'll give you a quote which says, the logic of neoliberal governmentality requires responsible, self-regulating, autonomous individuals to govern themselves in the context of a reconceptualized state project. So the state has become more privatized, that it hands out more and more things that it used to do to the private sector. And you have, and this is a quote from an article of Nandini Guptu, where she says that you have that this new context requires a self-governing entrepreneurial subject, and it produces self-governing entrepreneurial subjects. And it's about the development of self-regulation, self-direction, and self-management of enterprising selves. So in the material that I'll present you, I want to deal with both these perspectives. Right? You would be perhaps familiar with some of these ideas if you've been reading stuff on new middle classes, aspirations, neoliberalism, etc. So what I want to do is think about what is peculiar about the Indian circumstance. Is emotional labor accompanied by a search for a real self that is being subjugated? And is it possible to isolate specific sites of mediation? So you have state and private capital, where marginality is produced through and upon this apparently entrepreneurial subject. Do we actually have an entrepreneurial subject? Okay, that fits into this particular theory of neoliberalism. And finally, the one question I want to ask, this is a broader question, is what do we mean, because it's used so frequently, what do we actually mean by the term neoliberalism? What does it ethnographically mean? Does it actually mean anything beyond perhaps an all-purpose denunciatory term? So almost everything we don't like, we tend to say it's neoliberal. So there are liberal marriages, there are liberal universities, neoliberal infrastructure construction, there's neoliberal Bollywood cinema, there's neoliberal eating habits, etc., etc. So one of the things that often worries me as sociologists is that if you have one particular effect that is it is invoked to explain 100 different causes, then there's a problem with that term. It's a functionalist term, right? It seems to be one particular cause cannot explain many effects, right? So what do we mean by this term neoliberalism? And as sociologists, as social scientists, we shouldn't shy away from asking, at the risk of sounding politically incorrect, what does the term neoliberalism actually mean? Right? What is its analytical power? That's something that's worthwhile thinking about. Okay, my first case study is from this place called Rajpur. It's from a skills development center, and this is one scheme that run by the government of India. The second scheme I'll discuss with you is the Roshni scheme, which is for left-wing affected districts. And the third vignette I will give you is just from private personality development center, which also trains young people for new kinds of jobs. Right? They all train people for new kinds of jobs. Okay, so this one trains people for various kinds. So there's salespersons for retail, domestic BPO, and hospitality assistant under the DDU. It's called the DDU GKY, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Gramin Kaushal Yojana, right? It had plans of training about 100,000 people between 2014 and 2017, which is actually not been realized. But let me just give you this vignette and two other vignettes and then come back to a conclusion to think about some of these ideas that I'm talking to you about. Neoliberalism, the state, new forms of capital. What do they mean? How can social scientists look at this as distinct from a purely economistic analysis or a purely policy-driven analysis? Because I don't think these three are unlinked topics. So one of the things I'll say to you that most of the skills development programs are complete failures. Hundreds of crores have been poured in, and it's important for us to think about the broader social context within which work can be imagined. Why do these programs not work, right? So it's not just a cynical exercise in saying that, not cynical, it's not just an abstract exercise in saying that let's look at the theory of work, but if you're going to think about how social sciences actually might contribute to broader debates about work and social justice, etc., then perhaps we need to ask questions about why some programs don't work. What is wrong with them in terms of lack of social understanding? So the executive in charge. So this SDC, which is in Rajpur, is run by a very large India's one of the largest retail companies. I'll call it MG Corporation. I'll call this man Mr. Chauhan, who's in charge of the skill development program of MG Corporation. He earlier worked for Reliance. He's based in the headquarters in Gurgaon. This particular skills development center was a collaboration between the MG Corporation and the National Skills Development Corporation, NSDC, right? which is now charged with doing a lot of skills development, etc., etc. His next in command is a man called Arnab Datta, who till recently worked for an American company called Landmark Worldwide. Landmark is a international personal and professional growth training and development company. So I attended some of their, just to see what they do, some of the sessions, and Landmark does a lot of the training. They train individuals to become more open, to become more confident. They use a variety of psychological and management jargon. The large fees, and there are all kinds of people who go to Landmark training, and that it works through what it refers to breakthrough technology. I'm not going to go into this, but I'll put these terms in front of you in order to think about all the discourses of contemporary forms of management and work. So at one of the MG planning meeting, the company that runs this SDC, Mr. Chauhan, the head of skills development at MG, had invited 3 different organizations and experts to submit proposals for training and evaluation of the students at the SDCs. The attendees included a professor from a prominent management school, representatives of a company called Braintree Solutions, which is a social psychology firm that deals with behavioral measurements, the CEO of a company called Character Development Initiative, and 2 members of the Art of Living. Mr. Chauhan strongly believes that Art of Living can provide the important, what he calls, emotional training to village youth to develop the mindset that is required for, as he said, the modern workplace. And there's a great deal of attention from both training courses, and once trainees are placed in jobs, there's a great deal of attrition. A lot of people leave. And soon after this meeting, Braintree submitted a proposal for a program to screen potential trainees after they come to a village mobilization fair, which is the key site where recruitment for the SDCs happens. So Braintree's proposal consisted of three steps. There would be a screening, a behavioral checklist, level 1 screening, and level 2 screening, work, value, and motivational inventory, something known as WVMI. And level 3 is the employability skill factor, level 4 is behavioral interview, and then final enrollment into this. So this is near a village, near Jaipur, not very far, a small town which is surrounded a village. The first 80 batch of the students at Rajpur began their course in September 2014. So this is the course. I think they're sitting in a retail training course. So there were, there are classes on customer relations. What is a store format? The teacher asks. Customer relations and the importance of smiling. Their product categories, what is the difference between fair and lovely and fair and handsome, for example, the process of selling, which the teacher divides into different sections. There's advertising, how to attract the customer's attention, and then how to offer the customer alternatives to what he or she may want to buy, and then how to make the decision on behalf, or help the customer make the decision as to how to buy. The teacher explains different kinds of companies, the retail companies, trading companies, service companies. There are hospitality classes where students learn about the different departments in a hotel, such as front office and food and beverage. Do you know what a mini bar is? A teacher asks, for example. Okay. Do you know what a mini bar is? Students try their hand at selling a variety of goods. There's also a class on time management. Okay. And time is extremely, it's important to think about temporality in new context of production and consumption, because most village people are seen as outside modern context of time and temporality. So how do you introduce village people who are apparently outside the context of modern temporality into notions of time? The teacher draws a time matrix consisting of 2 rows, 2 columns, and 4 different headings. So between Braintree's 4-step evaluation system, the Art of Living's emotional training, and various time management techniques, the stage does indeed seem to be set for the institutionalization of what we might understand as enterprise culture. Okay? This is what we think enterprise culture. Through alignments between the state, the private sector, and marketized spiritual economies, such as the Art of Living. It appears to be an ambitious and significantly funded project of body and mind to produce new labor. But there are other narratives as well, and that's what I want to look at in this particular instance. Abhishek Kumar, who was the center in charge in Rajpur, tells me, he said, this entire belt, he said to me once, has a large population of Gujars and Meenas. He says, unwilling to take in Gujar and Meena trainees, as there he says that the mentality is different, and employers also are not willing to employ Gujar and Meenas. You know, I mean, I don't want to go into the longer history of the history of scheduled tribes and notion of criminal tribes, right? And you would be familiar with, okay. And he says that many large companies don't want to employ Gujar and Meena boys because the companies think they are notorious, he says, using that word. Even physical deliveries of goods ordered online are not made in Rajpur, he says. Abhishek says that because it is a notorious area, no DHL, etc. don't come to this area. Also, he adds, Meena boys come only to learn computers and get free food, as what they really want is to apply for government jobs. There's a flyer for the training program that is distributed widely, and it begins with the sentence, the government wants to give you jobs. The training, of course, is for private sector jobs. Okay? However, it's advertised as government jobs. And I'll come back to some of these ideas. Sunil Bhairwal, who asks, he says to me, why can't private jobs be made into government jobs? A government job, he said, has personality and respect. Another SDC employee, Rahul, tells me that nearby Hindon is, as he puts it to me, is a Daku area. It's an area full of robbers, he says. So no one wants to establish an SDC here. Gujars live in groups, he says, and they're not afraid of fighting. They are a martial race, he says, using that term. You must know how to be emotional with them. Talk to them about Desh Bhakti, patriotism. They're only scared of their Panch Patels, the heads of the villages. Their first choice, he says, is the army. If you fight with them, the entire group will land up at your doorstep. The art of living classes, he said, will change the attitudes. I also think, he concludes, that we should take Gujars after the age of 25. Their boiling blood, he said, then subsides. Ghanshyam Gujar is 22 and a student in the hospitality course. He tells me about the problem with Gujars, such as, he said, lack of self-discipline and the speaking problem. That is why we don't do well at interviews, he says. The government should open a center everywhere to improve Gujars, he says. And he adds, my father said, enroll in this course so that you can get a certificate. It will come in use later. In November 2014, the Rajpur SDC held a 2-day Art of Living course for various students, and now various people from Art of Living who go through Art of Living are employed as hostel wardens, etc., etc. One of my last conversations at the Rajpur SDC was with Ghanshyam Gujar. Some weeks ago, he started telling me, one of my friends from this center was interviewed at this big retail chain. His interview went very well, Ghanshyam said to me, but he didn't get the job. His evaluation form had come back with the comment, good, but Gujar. Character, behavior, talent, he said he had it all, but was rejected. One boy did not act Gujar to his name and was selected, but he was later rejected when they found out. I want to come back some of the ideas in popular discourse about caste, kinship, and what does it mean in terms of neoliberalism and producing entrepreneurial subjects. But let me get to my case 2. It is called Terrorists, Friends, and Mall Workers. So let me now shift to Ranchi. I'm on my way from Ranchi to the town of Chandwa in Latehar district to meet some of the recruits who had joined the first batch of the Roshni training program in January 2015 at the SDC run by a company called the TAG Foundation. I also want to meet their parents. This trip is primarily to meet those who had been trained, joined a position as a salesperson, but left after a few months. The Roshni program in Jharkhand has seen a high dropout rate, and Ministry of Rural Development officials in Delhi have expressed deep concern as it is a significant part of the Make in India project. Make in India strategy. And I'm accompanied by this trip by a project manager from the National Institute of Rural Development in Hyderabad, Harish. We drive approximately 20 kilometers from Chandwa to the village of Loharsi for the meeting. As we drive towards Chandwa, Harish repeats several times that we must leave Chandwa for Ranchi no later than 4 p.m. as it is, he says, a badly affected area. And you know that particular area has different Maoist groups. There's a Maoist insurgency there for a long time. And he said it is not safe to be on the roads in Latehar district after that time. Latehar and surrounding districts of Gumla and Palamu are part of the districts identified by the Ministry of Rural Development as left-wing extremist affected districts, LWEADs. With the Roshni program to apparently wean young people away from extremism is being, I put these in inverted commas, is being rolled out. So there's a variety of Maoist groups in that particular area. And Latehar is one of the first districts where mobilization had taken place. Okay. We drive towards Chandwa, which is about 80 kilometers from Ranchi. Along the way, there is the Stenford High School, another one called Oxbridge International High School. The countryside outside of Ranchi is mostly bone dry, with parched fields and mud houses and with thatched or mud tiled roofs. Sometimes, however, the two-lane highway passes through thick green forests with sal and mahua trees and palash flowers in full bloom. Women pass by with loads of wood on their heads, and every now and then we pass neatly stacked firewood on the roadside. There are sellers, also women, waiting under whatever shade they can find. There are scattered line hotels, which is what dhabas are called in Jharkhand. Motorcycles with up to 5 or 6 passengers, and a horizon filled with baking subdivided farming land. Every now and then we come across groups of boys throwing rocks at mango trees, trying to dislodge ripe fruit. There are buses going towards Gumla and Daltonganj, and many small commercial passenger vehicles with several passengers sitting on the roof. Halfway to Chandwa, it is halfway to Chandwa, it is 10:30 a.m. and around 42 degrees. As we get closer to town, the road alternates between unattended dry fields and thick forests. We descend into a valley towards Chandwa, and along a hillside, there's a central reserve police force outpost. We arrive at Chandwa at about 11:30. And we meet one of the employees of the TAG Foundation, we know, who runs the SDC. And he has arranged for a local mobilizer, Gautam Oraon, to meet us. Gautam is from a village nearby, and that I wanted to visit that village to meet someone who had once worked for Eureka Forbes in Ranchi. So after the training, he'd been employed in Eureka Forbes, but he left the job, and I was interested in why he left the job. We wait for Gautam Oraon, the mobilizer, near the Chandwa police station. There's a large signboard outside the police station with details about rehabilitation facilities for terrorists. Alongside this sign, there's another one that says, obey traffic rules. After about 20 minutes, Gautam arrives on his motorcycle and leads us to a road, onto a road off the highway, and we head towards Loharsi. TAG trainees always describe, if you ask them where they're from, they would always say, I'm from such and such Thana, because they lived in an environment which is constantly an environment which is their most immediate lives are connected to the police and the police station and the context of violence that's been a strong part of life in that part of the world for such a long time. The two-lane bitumen road to Loharsi is in surprisingly good condition. It has been newly laid, I am told, because of a recently constructed coal-fired power plant owned by Abhijit Industries. However, Vanil says that the plant is not operational, as there was a dispute regarding the payment of levy to the party, one of the parties that operates in that area, one of the Maoist parties that operates in the area. In any case, Loharsi received a reasonable motorable road in the bargain. As we drive toward Loharsi, ours is the only car on the road, and the silence around us is heightened by the heat. One of my co-passengers repeats several times that we have to leave this place by 4 p.m. It's not at all safe after that. Every now and then we pass groups of men, women, and children carrying bits of wood or some other load on their head. There's no public transport. By the time we arrived in Loharsi, it's around 12:30 p.m. and almost 50 degrees. We are told that many of the village men have gone off to a meeting, to a Van Adhikar, forest rights meeting organized by the party. We hastily move away from the building where that's the location of the meeting and towards the house of a shop owner, Vikas Ganju, whose son Ramesh we have come to meet. Ramesh had trained to be a door-to-door salesperson with Eureka Forbes. We are welcomed into the small house owned by Ramesh's family. We are seated in the small passageway. There's a strong hot wind that continuously blows through the passageway, making like an open oven. Most doors and windows are shut to keep out the loo, the hot wind, but the door to the passageway where we are seated is left open to let in light. The electricity has been gone for several hours. As mentioned earlier, TAG Foundation's first Roshni batch was recruited from Latehar. We planned to train about 50,000 to 100,000 people in about 2 years from BPL backgrounds, of which 50% have to be female, have to be young women. It seeks to place 75% of them in the organized sector. One of the first classes I attended at TAG's Ranchi-based Skills Development Center was on life skills. It's called life skills. A young woman is taking the class. We must learn the importance of a positive attitude, she begins. She asks students to fill in the blanks in the following sentences. Success follows those who are dash, dash, dash in all situations. What are the do's of positive relationships and attitude? She continues. Focus at work, take on challenges, plan ahead, and take care of yourself, she says. Today, she continues, we will discuss self-evaluation. Do you know what the Hindi for self-evaluation is? The class is unable to answer. Self-evaluation, she carries on in Hindi, means to test oneself, write something about oneself, like a short story, and evaluate oneself, mulyankan. You must be self-aware to carry out self-evaluation. So you've got So self-evaluation is also an important part of the customer sales agent program. There are various places where people from Latihar and Gumla learn through role play. What it is they're supposed to be doing. The new self must indicate the subjectivity rather than merely reflect upon it. Students engage in countless rounds of role play and are judged on demeanor as well as ability to align inner and outer selves of being. Do you know the meaning of empathy? A teacher asks. There are 3 states of empathy. She says listening, suggesting, inquiring. She also asks if they know what emotional bonding means. Interpersonal skills, she says, consist of empathy and emotional bonding. In order to connect with strangers, the customer, she says, you need empathy. And then there are, so you would think that there's an entire process that fits in with the contemporary processes of what scholars have identified as making of neoliberal subjectivity. As a researcher who's observed the process says, these programs center on the individual and in particular on the individual's ability to transfer his or her life through these interventions, enabling them to benefit from growth. And then you are introduced to different kinds of commodity cultures, which is obviously a very significant part of apparently making it the new self. There's a mock restaurants, there's sites for that, there are training sites. Students are so you're supposed to then reproduce behaviors that are beyond immediate family, locality and region to a sort of a cosmopolitan self. So people are taught to recognize different kinds of bread, different kinds of wine, different kinds of conflicts, etc., etc. Okay. So Ajay Ganju, who I mentioned just now, is from Latihar and worked as a salesperson for Eureka Forbes. His father is a landless laborer. I asked about his experience of the Roshni program. He said, I've learned body language, behavior, eye contact, how to stand. I've also learned to spot brands. I used to shake in my boots when speaking to an officer. That fear, he says, is gone. I'm a different person. But unprompted, he continues, he continues, my parents are like gods. And even though after training from here, I will be a different person, my relationship with them will not change. This conversation repeats itself with many others that I also speak to. I asked Ajay about the abuse he might face during his house-to-house calls to sell water purifiers. Actually, he says, controlling my emotions is not at all difficult. I don't find it a problem at all if you use soft skills. No matter how angry the customer is, he becomes shant, he becomes serene. Me, you don't feel troubled? Because there's a lot of there's a fair amount of discussion about the inner self and the outer self, how people divide themselves. So I was just trying to think about that. I said, you don't feel troubled when people talk to you like that? He said, Ajay says, not at all. There might be 1 or 2 calls that might trouble us, but if the company is giving you so much money, then you have to take some pressure, he said, using the word pressure. He continues, I've never lived outside the village, and now I am getting to learn a lot from customers. In order to get a government job, he says, he continues, you need knowledge in every sphere. I don't have it, and I'm in the process of gathering that knowledge. Government jobs are about settlement, he says, aren't they? Earlier, I was very hesitant and had very low confidence level. Now the confidence level is very high, and he uses these particular terms. I smile all the time, and I've learned from customers. Many of the SDCs classes end in Ranchi end with a particular game. And it's a variety of games that's played in different parts of the world. The game in Ranchi in many of the classes is called Spot the Terrorist. I don't know if you know those. So that there are a group of people, and if the so-called terrorist winks at you, then you're dead. So they all end with this game. So the manner in which the cultural context of violence has been. So I'm trying to point to the larger context with which people is, so that even a game like Spot the Terrorist is a game that has been normalized as a game that increases your skills of interacting with people, of reacting in a particular way. So providing instructions for the game, the teacher says, if the terrorist winks at you, you are dead. And everyone must combine to spot the terrorist before he or she too gets killed. Everyone plays the game with gusto. I'll end this here, and I'm going to come back to my third, and then I'll conclude. My third is an example, is from this company that I'm going to call Westwing. Westwing is a cabin crew training company. It trains for flight attendants. It's very large, spread all over India. Perhaps it has branches in Gujarat as well. And many young women come to Westwing to train as cabin crew. Of course, most of them don't end up as cabin crew. They actually end up in many sort of so-called big farms in South Delhi as hostesses, etc., etc. It combines mixture of management jargon, dietary prescription, naturopathy, bodily techniques, self-help discourses, and frameworks drawn from global psychology. Etc., etc. So I want to focus on one young woman, and I'll call her Mary Masih. She's Christian. Mary Masih was one of the first students I met at Westwing. She lives in Kailashpuri, which is a resettlement colony in West Delhi. Her father owns a small sari shop, which is, you know, that little thing on the ground that you can see, a little banner. He owns a little sari shop. His father lived on the campus of St. Stephen's College in Delhi, where his uncle worked as a gardener. Okay, and then his father kind of moved into this unauthorized locality, and slowly the locality became authorized. So, to start with, Mary's parents were quite against her joining Westwing to become an air hostess. But now her mother says that, you know, and her elder sister said that we never got the chance to do these things, and we are glad that she's doing it. Initially, Mary would leave home in a pair of jeans and then change into a tight top and mini skirt she was required to wear for training. As well, she was forbidden to wear makeup at home. After 6 months of training, her parents said it was fine to wear makeup at home. When I first met Mary at Westwing, she was part of a class that was practicing the tongue twister, Betty Botter bought some butter. One by one, all the students stood in front of the class and tried reciting the verse, invariably failing to complete. The recitation is part of the project of transforming the provincial female self. It involves language, enunciation, skincare, gait, hair, learning, deference, knowledge of commodities, temporal discipline, and training the body according to specific biomechanical etiquette. And significantly, a retraining of the emotions. It is impossible to disentangle these aspects as separate domains of inquiry. Betty Botter is also part of a project of effacing what is known as MTI, Mothertongue Influence. It's a common term that is used amongst a lot of these training institutes. The Punjabis, one teacher told me, have the least problem with MTIs, and the Biharis, the greatest. The Biharis are the hardest working, she went on to say, and the most intelligent, but their MTI problem is the most acute. A significant part of the training of this, retraining the self is to present it as another through unrelenting retraining of the body. The body is the language and vice versa. As one teacher told his class, English requires more jaw movements as compared to Hindi. He then proceeded to demonstrate 3 types of jaw movements. All students took turns to copy the movements, the body still and the faces contorting in different directions. All of you must soften your voices, another teacher says. Soften R, T, D. English is a very soft language. Intonation is very important. Adopt a soft tone. The sharpness has to go away. Language, emotions, and the body are linked, and effacing MTI also involves other kinds of corporeal training, including a complete overhaul of oral techniques. Students are taught to reduce words per minute, moderate volume, and alter pitch and how you speak. And of course, more jaw movements. The body must be trained to enter the service industry. Pace, pitch, power, pause, the teacher calls out when he's training people. So the acquisition of this version of cosmopolitanism is also the context of a biopolitical dialogue, right, about the relationship between surface and depths, that your surface must be quite different to the kind of depth you've come from. You may have come from 18, 20 years of being a particular kind of person, but then you must become something else in about 6 months' time or 12 months' time. So it is firstly about deep immersion in surface behavior. And secondly, about ensuring appropriate retraining of sensibilities such that longer and possible disruptive ways of being MTI are brought into line with newly acquired dispositions. The body must move in tandem. Okay? The teachers repeatedly stress that being less emotional is key to a successful career in the new world economy. So you can see, for example, so far what I've been saying to you, it fits in very well with the idea of emotional labor. Okay? And how one utilizes emotions. Okay, and so there's certain things you're not supposed to do. So sometimes students are asked to write down what are their hobbies, and someone once wrote listening to sad songs, and she was severely reprimanded because you're not supposed to, these kinds of emotions you're not supposed to express in the new workplace. Mary once told me that after the Westwing training, she'd become more confident as she had learned to control her emotions and discuss things, as she put it, in a rational manner. The teachers at Westwing thought that there was a specific relationship between gender, emotions, and confidence. So according to them, it explained why young women were keener learners. As one teacher put it to me, she said, the time period that a girl has for picking up new skills is very small because of concerns about marriage. So she wants to learn as much as possible and as quickly as possible. For this, girls must overcome emotional attitudes so that the limited time that they have can be devoted to learning. However, on the other hand, the confident and rational female self is dogged by an anxiety. As one of the trainees put it to me, she said, when we get married, we'll be able to introduce ideas of personality development into our families. However, she continued, there's a difference between confidence and overconfidence. Overconfidence, she concluded, turns into pride. We have to learn to strike the balance. Mary, who I last met on an Indigo flight between Pune and Delhi, has come a long way from her home in the formerly unauthorized colony of Kailashpuri and Mangopur. This is where her parents live, actually. And she's an air hostess with Indigo right now. But it's difficult to say where she's going. She says her parents will soon look for a groom for her, but she adds that she can hardly be expected to marry a man from Kailashpuri and Mangolpuri. The 12 months at Westwing appear to have given her a surface that is also a depth. There's a specific manner in which she negotiates a new context, what I want to refer to as moral consumption. Moral consumption. This is a context where the apparently enterprising, autonomous, self-regulating subject of neoliberalism encounters local histories and constraints. Mary's father tells me, he once said to me, we have instilled strong Christian values in her and know that she will not overstep her limits. Our neighbors, he asserted, never say anything about her because our daughter has never given them an occasion to say anything. Mary, he says, has always been careful to balance her life. Mary will never lose her real self, he continued, because we have given her strong family values. Thanks to Westwing, he added, my daughter is now rid of her mother-tongue influence, but she will always remain close to her mother. I'll conclude. So Mary is a moral consumer. She does her consumption in a specific manner with an idea of morality. Let me just conclude. What do these three vignettes, how do I link them? How do I try and link them to some of the ideas I've been talking about? Let me just pose some questions by way of a conclusion. The Gujar young men from Rajpur, the Latehar, there's a particular term the government in India use here. It's called the PTGs, that it's training, primitive tribal groups. It's an official term. So PTGs of Latehar, who are in the SDC, who are in the Skills Development Center, and Mary Masih from Kailashpuri, allow us to ask certain questions about the relationship between different sides such as the state, private capital, the family, and non-state actors such as Maoists. That it seemed to me complicate easy conclusions regarding new forms of work, neoliberalism, and contemporary ideas of the self, contemporary self in India. So I want to conclude by returning to the early discussion I had about people talking about the real self and the authentic self. That increasingly that the real self is under attack under contemporary capitalism, emotional labor is where the real self is hidden away from public display. That the contemporary forms of capitalism work are a site of loss of real self. I want to say to you that in fact what I want to suggest to you is that emotional labor may not, as others have suggested, simply be a site of a loss of a real self under capital, but rather a way in which a split self, which is the real self, is utilized in the making of contemporary subjectivity that negotiates an external world of power and dominance in order to secure a degree of autonomy. Ajay Ganju. So what I want to begin with the idea not that there is actually a whole self that operates in the real world. I would like to suggest to you that in our everyday interactions we already operate with split selves, which is not a psychoanalytic drawback. Like in split self analysis is a sense of abnormality. What if we were to posit the notion of the split self as not the liminal self, but the permanent self? Okay, so and the manner in which the split self is utilized in the making of a contemporary subjectivity that negotiates an external and existing world of power and dominance in order to secure a degree of autonomy. Ajay Ganju from Latehar is one of the many among his cohort who seeks to convert lessons in emotional labor into a government job. What he really wants is simultaneously, as many people think of the Sarkar as an oppressor, as well Kailashpuri's Mary Masih seeks to be a moral consumer that is both of the world but also the family. The real self is a strategic and threshold self, ready to strike out in many directions rather than committed to a singular, deep idea of subjectivity, fearful of losing this deep self to the apparent commercialization of emotions. Perhaps it is worthwhile theorizing the split or fragmented self within anthropology and sociology as a crucial site of contemporary self-making, rather than as debris in modernity's wake. The split self moves seamlessly between family ties, desires and hatreds towards the state, and strategic, but not necessarily committed entrepreneurialism. Affects and public displays of emotions are sites of negotiations with a world one cannot change. The idea of losing control over the use of emotions perhaps both romanticizes affects and emotions and misreads the complexities of agencies. So in brief, what I'm saying to you is the notion that people are constantly seeking to preserve an inner self outside an attack on the outer self romanticizes the manner in which people utilize the resources they have at their hand in order to negotiate a very complex world they can't change. Further, how to think more explicitly about the linkage between citizenship and market forces in India. So for Iowa Ong suggested that the elements that we think of as coming together to create citizenship, rights, entitlements, territoriality, and nation are becoming disarticulated and rearticulated with forces set into motion by market forces. In fact, in many of these cases, people utilize market forces in order to get closer to the state. And most of the training system that people are part of, that the state runs, provided by private players, actually ways and means that people try to gain certain skills in order to then do what they want with it, which is get a government job. So it's not so much the market alienates people from older notions of citizenship, but in many ways it is possible that in unintended ways the market provides certain capacities for people to utilize these capacities in ways that they cannot otherwise, they're not equipped to do, simply because they don't have access to it. So rather than, okay, so let me just conclude. So in a recent comment, the logic of neoliberal governmentality, it has been said that it requires responsible, self-regulating, autonomous individuals, etc., and that neoliberalization depends on the development of self-regulation, self-direction, and self-management of enterprising selves. My own material asks me to rethink a formulation of this kind. So Ajay Ganju from Latehar takes part in a skills development scheme that seeks to produce entrepreneurial subjects through a process that could be characterized as neoliberal. For it is a context that signifies the changing relationship between state and private capital, but through this process, Ajay Ganju adopts a new skin and learns the art of emotional labor. However, for him, the apparently neoliberal training in emotional labor is primarily directed towards one end, getting a government job. And simultaneously, notwithstanding notions of entrepreneurialism the state wishes to train him in, he remains deeply attached to his family, kin, and caste networks, unwilling to take self-directed decisions that are not in accord with his family's wishes. One of the greatest failures of this skills development is that although the people are sent to Bangalore and other cities to work from Jharkhand, they come back as soon as there's a birth in the family, as soon as there's a marriage in the family, as soon as the harvest season. And that is so that people continue to be located in deeper, older structures of kin and caste networks, rather than get produced simply as entrepreneurial subjects. And I'm perhaps not the only person who's saying this. I mean, as one anthropologist who has worked in Ethiopia says that that to conceive of Ethiopian youth and what they do in terms of a neoliberal era implies that neoliberalism is a primary contextual factor in determining cultural and economic processes and closes off possibilities for inquiry. So for the Indian context, I think there are several questions to be asked when we seek to apply the idea of neoliberalism. Is it possible, for example, to suggest that an aspect of citizenship project we are witnessing in certain sections of the population in our part of the world is not only about the self of the home of the world, but about threshold selves, people always on thresholds, and it is also about the translation of surface selves into surface rather than deep citizenship. We may be witnessing a context of cosmopolitanism that is entangled with new forms of work, and which is quite different from the ways in which cosmopolitanism has been otherwise theorized. This is perhaps a form of cosmopolitan citizenship where enterprise ethic, market form, and the attempted universalization of rational economic conduct encounters identities of caste and tribe, long-standing desires for the state, erratic capitalism, political violence, and deep entrenchment within networks of family and kinship. So I suppose by way of some kind of conclusion, what I'm asking is this: how do we think of a situation in India that might be characterized by neoliberal processes, but does not actually produce neoliberal subjects? So what is that situation where you have neoliberal processes, public-private partnerships, the state dealing much more with the corporate sector, but there are there are not necessarily any neoliberal subjects. So how do we understand this particular context? That is to say, given the kinds of political, economic, and social worlds in which the Gujar young men of Rajpur, the Latehar-based recruits to skills development, and Mary Masih from Kailashpuri are located, what is the extent to which neoliberal imaginaries are translated into neoliberal realities? But to get a grip on all this, I think we need to move beyond treating neoliberalism as a conceptual rubbish bin capable of accommodating multiple distasteful phenomena, and try to think about the contradictory possibilities offered to marginal populations by new forms of relationships between the state and private capital. And I'll just stop there.